Hello everybody and welcome to this video on the Battle of Coronel. It's going to be a slightly different format to usual in as much as this is going to be a collaboration which will serve hopefully to enhance the video itself and also to introduce you to a relatively new channel, The Shipyard, and more details on that at the end. But anyway, the Battle of Coronel was the result of a chain of events that had been unleashed by the outbreak of World War I, but whose roots go back far beyond the beginning of the conflict, and are based more in the overseas imperial ambitions of various nations than in any particular aspect of European continental politics, which is of course what would actually have led to the war in 1914.
European powers had been operating in what for them was the Far East for centuries. Initially for the spice trade. Later, as conflicts between the merchant interests of Europe and more local nations developed, various nations began either aligning with or being taken over by a number of European nations, Britain, France and the Netherlands being the most prominent, with showings from Spain, Portugal and even the Russians amongst others. Notably absent was Germany, on the rather good ground that Germany, as a nation, didn't actually exist, and Prussia was trying to fight off competing interests from France and Russia for most of the period. Sometimes, literally.
By the time the late 19th century rolled around, this had mostly solidified into a system where most of the Western Pacific was held by one colonial power or another, with a few exceptions such as Japan and the majority of mainland China. But even in these cases, pressure to cede control of, or at least access to, various ports was very high. Despite being the larger country, both by geography and population, China was actually more susceptible to this pressure on account of, well, having a larger and thus more attractive economy to trade with, and also having been quite badly mauled in the Opium Wars, when a number of British merchant interests had decided to literally bring opiates to the masses in order to try and redress a trade imbalance, at gunpoint if the Chinese government objected. Despite being forced to open for foreign trade by a US naval mission, Japan was aiming to go down a slightly different route. By rapidly industrialising and forming an alliance with the British Empire, they were in a far stronger position to defend their own interests, and between their own rapidly modernising shipyards and those of Britain, they were rapidly assembling a modern fleet.
Into the mix came the Germans, the newly formed country looking to establish its own colonial empire, as every fashionable European country had to have one, only to find that at this time, all the other countries had gotten their towels onto various available benches first, and there wasn't much left. Thus they had to wait until a minor diplomatic incident with China arose, and then duly browbeat the Chinese into giving them over some land, where they promptly began construction of a port, Tsingtao, to defend their new port, as well as a number of small islands they were in the process of acquiring in the area. They needed a colonial naval force, the East Asia Squadron. Initially, this was a loose collection of colonial gunboats and very small cruisers that only posed a real threat to unmanned merchants and local junks. But as the German naval build-up continued, more powerful and numerous vessels became available, and so the East Asia Squadron grew. Thus, by the mid-1914, the force consisted of two of the most powerful armoured cruisers ever built, the two Scharnhorst class, along with small but modern protected cruisers, Emden, Leipzig, and Nuremberg, plus a handful of older, smaller cruisers, torpedo boats, and gunboats of minimal true combat value.
However, this build-up had not gone unnoticed, and a variety of other naval assets were present in the region. Russian and French vessels of varying size and power, plus two major forces. The Royal Australian Navy, led by the outside context problem HMAS Australia, which could be described as a version 1.5 battlecruiser designed explicitly to murder ships exactly like those making up the East Asia Squadron. And of course, there was the Imperial Japanese Navy, which by this point had a varied collection of battleships and cruisers, in part thanks to the Russians in 1905, as well as the even bigger outside context problems of the Congo-class battlecruisers, two of which were now in service. If the Australia was a problem, and indeed the commander of the East Asia Squadron, Admiral Maximilian von Spee, reckoned it more powerful than his entire force, the two Congos compared to the East Asia Squadron, were about as much overkill as taking a TARDIS back 65 million years to ensure that the dinosaur-killing asteroid landed on top of a particularly vexing walnut. Understandably, after having detached the Emden on a solo raiding expedition into the Indian Ocean, von Spee took every ship that he could gather that could make the voyage and, after shooting up a few Allied installations, made tracks very quickly out into the Pacific, picking up Emden's sister ship Dresden along the way. This proved to be very wise, as the various German colonies, including Tsingtao, fell rapidly to the advances of various Allied fleets. Von Spee had chosen the Pacific as the USA was still neutral, as were most South American countries, whereas travelling through the Western Pacific into the Indian Ocean would have involved inviting the close attention of every single Allied ship in both oceans, including anything the British happened to send from the Mediterranean via the Suez Canal. Conversely, there was very little Allied naval presence in the Eastern Pacific, and there were a number of important trade routes that could be disrupted.
The British, via signals intelligence, learned of this plan and dispatched Rear Admiral Christopher Craddock to stop him. Craddock was possessed of not an especially impressive force. He had been in charge of the 4th Cruiser Squadron, formerly the North American and West Indies Squadron, which existed largely to ensure no other European powers messed around with the Western Atlantic. The Royal Navy, having ironically been the main enforcers of the Monroe Doctrine for quite a while. The downgrade of the unit reflected the rising of the US Navy and its ability to manage the task itself, and so Craddock's units had mostly been hunting for odd German raiders, whilst it itself was comprised of mostly older ships from the reserves that had been hastily crewed by reservists and volunteers, since the more modern and regular service vessels had been in greater demand closer to home. Good Hope had left England with a crew that was mostly 90% reservists.
At the time of his instructions to hop over to the other side of South America and guard the trade routes, Craddock had a smaller and significantly weaker force: 2 armoured cruisers, the Good Hope and Monmouth, 1 light cruiser, the Glasgow, and an armed merchant cruiser, the Otranto. Von Spee therefore had a 5-4 advantage in numbers, and whilst the Glasgow, which was an early model town-class cruiser, was significantly superior to any of von Spee's protected cruisers, there was only 1 of it, and 3 of them. The Otranto was a relatively slow-moving ocean liner compared to the warships, with a scattering of light guns that was about as effective as it sounded. The armoured cruisers were also not a match for the German ships. HMS Monmouth was armed entirely with shorter-range 6-inch guns, whilst HMS Good Hope did have a couple of powerful 9.2-inch guns. The rest of its weapons were also 6-inch guns, and in both cases many of them were mounted in low casemates that were worryingly close to the water, which restricted both their range and their usability. Indeed, Admiral Fisher had commented, "Guns on the main deck are practically useless. We know this from experience. Half the time they cannot see the object for want of view, and the other half they are flooded out by the sea." Nonetheless, there were other ships available, but they'd been instructed to form a squadron on the Atlantic side of South America, just in case von Spee slipped past Craddock into that operational area.
Recognising the situation, the Admiralty had decided to reinforce Craddock with the more modern armoured cruiser, HMS Defence, whose high-mounted battery of 9.2 and 7.5-inch guns should be significantly superior to the German ships, and would present a 3 versus 2 scenario, which would require Glasgow and Otranto only to hold out in their own reserved 2-on-3 combat long enough for 1 or more of the larger ships to come to their aid. Then the Admiralty changed their mind and diverted Defence temporarily to patrol the Atlantic zone that Craddock had been forced to leave, instead giving him the command of the pre-dreadnought HMS Canopus. This was an even more powerful vessel than the Defence, and on paper made Craddock unassailable. Indeed, von Spee was of the opinion that his ships could do virtually nothing to the old pre-dreadnought.
However, the situation was not as clear-cut as it now appeared. For a start, the squadron was slowed by Otranto only being capable of 16 knots, and now it was further slowed by Canopus being capable of only 12 knots, which made interception, the goal that the Admiralty had instructed Craddock to aim for, effectively impossible. After the fact, it would actually turn out to not quite be the case. Canopus was in fact capable of 16.5 knots, but her chief engineer was in the middle of a full-on mental breakdown trending into insanity, and had about the same grip on the complex realities of naval engines and boilers as a rat being used to test the effects of LSD. In some ways, it was a wonder the ship was even going vaguely in the right direction at all, albeit that the only thing that was actually wrong with it was a leaky piston rod gland, which could have been fixed in a couple of hours and would have allowed Canopus to hit 17 knots or possibly even pushing close to her original design speed of 18. Under the impression that the defence would arrive soon, Craddock's force crawled up the western side of South America, having left communications range with London just before an order to only face von Spee with Canopus in company arrived, leaving them without this key bit of instruction. The Admiralty itself was in something of an upheaval and slow to react, as public opinion had turned rather nasty, not helped by newspaper campaigns, and the existing First Sea Lord, Prince Louis of Battenberg, was in the process of being forced out of his job, one that he'd actually done relatively well up to this point, purely because he happened to be of rather obvious German descent. Thus, between this and various other miscommunications, Craddock thought he was under orders to advance to contact with von Spee via any means necessary, and was expecting defence to arrive to help him, whilst the Admiralty now wanted him to play it safe, stay with the battleship, and await further instruction. Winston Churchill was at this point filling in for Prince Louis, whilst Admiral Fisher was dusted off and installed in his place, and as an ex-army civilian-turned-politician, Churchill had substantially less understanding of the nuances of naval communication as compared to either Prince Louis or Fisher. Thus, when Craddock signalled his intention to leave the apparently glacial Canopus behind and advance on von Spee, he received a corresponding signal back stating that his forces were considered sufficient and that defence was staying on the east side of South America. Craddock assumed that his message had been understood, and thus these interception orders would stand, whilst in fact Churchill had actually missed or misconstrued the bit about leaving Canopus behind.
There was one further fly in the ointment. Rear Admiral Trowbridge was awaiting a court-martial after failing to show enough aggression in the Med, and whilst in command of a formation of considerably more powerful armoured cruisers, had declined to push on and try and fight the battle cruiser Goeben. Mindful of the shame of effectively being called a coward, Craddock had resolved to push on, despite being relatively acutely aware of that his chances without either defence or Canopus was not good at all. By this time, Fisher had gotten himself familiar with everything that was going to be immediately saw this problem and was horrified, ordering defence to immediately proceed to join Craddock and reissuing the orders to stay in formation with Canopus. Unfortunately, these orders were not issued until the 3rd of November 1914, and by this point, Craddock and many of his command were already 2 days dead.
Both sides were initially hoping to snipe off part of the other's command. Craddock was chasing down Leipzig and von Spee was chasing down Glasgow, both of them operating on the strength of intercepted signals and reports. In both cases, the rest of the fleet maintained good enough radio discipline that the other side didn't realise that they were heading into a full-fledged engagement of forces. As the 1st of November dawned, the two fleets nonetheless adopted very different procedures. Von Spee was now acting on a specific report that Glasgow had been seen leaving Coronel harbour with messages, and so the East Asia Squadron was proceeding as a single unit, with the armoured cruisers in the lead. Meanwhile, Craddock, who knew only that a ship that was using Leipzig's call sign was somewhere in the area, had spread his forces out in a line abreast to cover the widest possible front. In fact, all of von Spee's ships were using Leipzig's call sign, specifically to confuse Allied intercepts. Ironically enough, though, it was in fact Leipzig herself that first spotted the smoke from the British ships, whilst first Leipzig and then the other German ships were spotted by Glasgow and Otranto. Craddock realised the situation and ordered his ships to turn and head south, aiming to try and meet up again with Canopus, which, as he had signalled the Admiralty, had been left behind to catch up. But this now put him in a catch-22. His warships could make 20 knots, dictated largely by the speed of Monmouth, and with the German armoured cruisers only faster by about walking pace, he might just have enough of a head start to make it to Canopus before they caught him. But Otranto, as we mentioned previously, was only capable of 16 knots, which would see the force caught within the next few hours. If he left it behind, the converted liner would be sunk in short order, and so Cradock decided to stay with it at the reduced speed, hoping against hope that Canopus might make something close to its design speed and meet up with them in time. Realising his advantage, von Spee hauled into the outer edges of engagement range and then held position, reorganising his force before pressing onwards to ensure that they were optimally arranged, and also waiting for evening. He was to the northeast of the British ships, and as the sun set in the west, his own ships would be lost in the growing darkness, whilst his opponents would be backlit by the setting sun, making the Germans harder to hit and giving his own gunners superb targeting conditions. In the later accountings by one of the German officers,
Scharnhorst hoisted a flag signal, pursue the enemy, full speed ahead. As the flags were lowered, the leading ship turned to starboard towards the enemy. The water broke foaming over their bows as the vessels turned and raced on over the sea. It surged right over their forecastles. The German ships shuddered under the heavy thudding of their engines. The smoke poured out of their funnels in thick, heavy swathes and streamed behind the squadron. The Admiral dreaded the night, which would provide cover for the enemy. It was terrible to think that he might escape. The minutes flew by one after another. They were but slowly gaining on the enemy. The wild chase had already lasted over an hour. At 1750 a fresh vessel was sighted. She proved to be the Good Hope, and placed herself at the head of the English line. The two squadrons were approaching each other on a nearly parallel southerly course, and their battle ensigns were hoisted on their masts. Just as the sun was sinking in a blood-red flame of fire, the fight began.
Cradock was no fool and recognised exactly what von Spee was doing. He decided that he needed to close the range and initiate the fight well before sunset, during which time the higher sun would dazzle the German gun layers, giving the British the advantage. But, using his superior speed, von Spee declined engagement twice as afternoon turned into evening. Finally, at 1850, the sun set, and the East Asia Squadron closed for the kill.
Before we cover the battle itself, a quick recap on the forces present. The Royal Navy had HMS Good Hope and HMS Monmouth, whose armaments we've mentioned earlier. HMS Glasgow, of the Town class of scout cruisers, was armed with 2 single 6-inch guns and 10 4-inch weapons, and was the fastest ship of the squadron. Otranto was equipped with 8 single 4.7-inch guns. Von Spee was bringing in 2 modern Scharnhorst-class armoured cruisers, both armed with 8 8.2-inch guns and 6 5.9-inch weapons. SMS Dresden, leadership of her class, armed with 10 single 4.1-inch guns and was the fastest ship in the fleet. SMS Leipzig, of the Bremen class, was armed with 10 single 4.1-inch guns. And finally, SMS Nuremberg, a Königsberg-class cruiser, again armed with 10 4.1-inch guns.
The situation at the start of the battle is badly tilted against Cradock. Not only do the Germans have the superior firing position, but as their forces close in, the Germans can bring 12 of their 16 heavy 8.2-inch guns to bear, whilst the British have a single 9.2-inch gun aboard Good Hope to reply with, as the aft gun is obscured whilst the ship closes in. Von Spee orders his ships to open fire, with the range estimated at 12,300 yards. Spee's flagship, SMS Scharnhorst, fires at HMS Good Hope, and SMS Gneisenau fires at HMS Monmouth. Good Hope's single available heavy gun replies, whilst Monmouth is entirely unable to engage, as her 6-inch guns are still well out of range.
Otranto receives fire from Dresden and Gneisenau and retreats to the west. Even her smaller guns are still out of range, and her speed is too low to effectively close the range, her captain choosing to withdraw from the battle instead of throwing himself into the German guns.
HMS Glasgow finds itself in a sporadic gunfight with Leipzig and Dresden. The larger German ships are ignoring Glasgow. The smaller German ships refuse to close to a range where their smaller guns might be effective out of concern for Glasgow's own heavier battery, which includes a pair of 6-inch guns that have considerably more stopping power than the Germans' own primary weapons.
Scharnhorst's third salvo disabled the forward 9.2-inch turret of the Good Hope and set the forecastle afire, depriving the British ships of even the solitary means of reply. Now caught in range of the fastered enemy, Craddock knew he must keep closing the range regardless of incoming shell fire. His only chance now is the workable 6-inch guns putting down a hail of fire to overwhelm the Germans at point-blank range.
Holding the upper hand, von Spee orders his ships to try and open the range, fearing that the British ships plan to use their torpedoes in a close-range assault. But it'll take some time to pull off this manoeuvre, and all the while the British are continuing to close. The range is down to around 7,000 yards, but whilst the British 6-inch guns that can fire are putting up a furious cannonade, some of them are still out of range, and an 8.2-inch shell from Gneisenau blows the roof off Monmouth's forward turret and starts a fire, leading to an ammunition explosion that sends the entire turret flying clean off the ship. For obvious reasons, recounting of this part of the battle is only recorded by the German side.
In most cases, hits by high explosive shells were immediately followed by outbreaks of fire. Twice I observed what I believed to be an explosion of ammunition. The flames shot up immediately after hits by high explosive shells and were distinguishable from the other fires by their dimensions and outline. Some hits, probably on the deck, sent up showers of sparks over a wide area. When armor was hit, thick black clouds with sharp outlines were observed. Hits were so frequent that it was impossible to note them in chronological order. The Good Hope received serious hits in the forepart of the ship, on the upper bridge, on the mast above 30 feet above the deck, and on the after side of the foretop. She was also hit repeatedly amidships, most of them causing fires. The after battery was hit several times and fires broke out. The flames in the interior of the ship could be seen through the portholes. 2 shells struck the ship near the aft turret. The Monmouth was hit on a 4-6-inch turret. The high explosive shell blew off the roof. A terrific explosion of charges must then have blown the whole turret off the forecastle, for it disappeared completely. I observed that many shells struck the ship amidships. A huge column of fire, almost as high as the masts and 60 or 90 feet across, suddenly shot up on the starboard side. Between 30 and 40 hits were counted in all. At times, 3 or 4 fires were burning simultaneously.
The range is closed to 6,000 yards, but German fire has simply grown more accurate, whilst even at this range, those guns that are able to work in a seaway and are still intact are having problems picking out the German ships except by their gun flashes aboard the British vessels. Both British armoured cruisers are heavily on fire, which makes them even easier targets, whilst the setting sun means that the German ships are all but invisible in the growing murk. The seas are also heaving, sending ships from all sides bobbing and rolling like corks. The more experienced German crews remain able to keep their ships in action, whilst the accuracy of British fire from the many reservists aboard Craddock's ships slackens still further.
HMS Monmouth is knocked out of the fight by repeated further hits and begins to fall out of line. Spee orders all fire to be concentrated on Good Hope, which is still trying to close the range to bring its more available 6-inch guns and the aft 9.2-inch to play. If all else fails, ramming is still on the table.
Good Hope charges directly at the German ships with a clear intention to ram. Using their superior speed and the indicative marker that is the flaming foredeck of the British ship, they avoid the attempted melee attack and instead blast away from all sides. Within minutes, the Good Hope is drifting out of control and aflame from stem to stern. An officer aboard HMS Glasgow observes the action. A continuous sheet of flame appeared along the sides of Good Hope and Monmouth, on which the heavy sea seemed to have no effect. Both ships, however, continued to fight some guns and were rewarded with a few hits. The smoke from their funnels was reddened by the dull glare of the fires below. Frequently, either ship flashed into a vivid orange as a lyddite shell detonated against her upper works. By 1945, by which time it was quite dark, Good Hope and Monmouth were obviously in distress. Monmouth yawed off to starboard, burning furiously and heeling slightly. Good Hope, after 3/4 of an hour of action, was firing with only a few of her guns. The fires on board were increasing their brilliance. At 1950 there was a terrible explosion on board between her mainmast and her after funnel. The gust of flames reached a height of over 200 feet, lighting up a cloud of debris that was flung still higher in the air. She lay between the lines, a low black hull, lighted by a dull glow. No one on board the Glasgow actually saw her founder, but she could not have survived many minutes. As observed by Glasgow, the fires now reach the forward magazine of Good Hope and they explode, blowing off the ship's bow. Within minutes, she breaks up and disappears beneath the waves, dropping the battlefield back into darkness. Scharnhorst switches fire to the crippled Monmouth, whilst Gneisenau joins in to help Leipzig and Dresden with the Glasgow. As Glasgow is not on fire and darkness has well and truly set in, both sides are now left aiming at gun flashes. But faced with a 3 versus 1 engagement, the captain of Glasgow realises nothing is to be gained by continuing the fight and orders his guns to cease fire, depriving the Germans of their target. Glasgow at this point has only been lightly damaged. The 4.1-inch guns of the smaller German cruisers have troubled it fairly little. With only one compartment flooded, she is still faster than most of her enemies. Instead, Glasgow heads towards Monmouth's last known location.
Glasgow finds Monmouth, which has put out its fires and in likewise cloaked in the darkness, finding the ship sinking slowly, but aiming for the Chilean coast whilst keeping her relatively intact stern lined with the heavy seas. Although the ship is taken on water over the bow, there is nothing Glasgow can do, and with intensifying moonlight threatening to reveal them both, Glasgow heads to the south to warn the forces on the other side of the continent of what has transpired.
One of Glasgow's officers describes the encounter thus. There was no answer to our signal. It was obvious that the Monmouth could neither fight nor fly. She was badly down by the bows, listing to port with the glow of her ignited interior brightening the portholes below her quarterdeck. It was essential that there should be a survivor of the action to turn Canopus, which was hurrying at her best speed to join us, and if surprised alone, she must have shared the fate of the other ships. Monmouth was therefore reluctantly left to her fate, and when last seen was bravely facing the oncoming enemy. Glasgow increased to full speed and soon left the enemy astern, losing sight of them at about 2050. SMS Nürnberg, bringing up the rear of the German formation, spots a plume of smoke from the departing Glasgow, but the British ship is well out of range. Moments later, they spot the silent Monmouth almost stopped with a list to port. Nürnberg closes to investigate, but even as it does so, Monmouth's list increases rapidly to the point that no gun on the port side can elevate to engage anything. Nürnberg pulls up to within a few ship lengths and shines a spotlight on the white ensign to try and indicate to any survivors that Monmouth should strike her colours and surrender. However, there is no movement from the slowly capsizing vessel. Nürnberg then fires a salvo over the ship. Still nothing. A torpedo is then fired, which misses. Far to the south, Glasgow sees the searchlight and the gunfire.
Monmouth suddenly comes alive, increasing speed and turning towards Nuremberg, which opened fire in earnest and then pulls away.
Monmouth capsizes, the increasing swell of the sea meaning that Nürnberg's captain deems it too rough to try and rescue any survivors, and so now both British armoured cruisers have gone down with all hands. This last action in the battle is likewise only recorded for us by German accounts.
She was recognized to be the Monmouth, with her flag still flying. Her foremost 6-inch turret was missing, her engines were running and her steering gear was apparently undamaged as she maneuvered quickly up to the end. As she did not hold down her flag, the Nürnberg opened fire at about 2120 and between 1000 and 600 yards and fired a torpedo from the port side as she turned away. The torpedo missed. The Nürnberg then ceased fire as it was not replied to and switched off her searchlights. The Monmouth still kept her flags flying and turned towards the Nürnberg, either to ram or to bring her starboard guns to bear. Captain von Schönberg therefore opened fire again, turning at high speed and passing under the Monmouth's stern. The unprotected parts of the Monmouth's hull and also her decks were torn open by the shells. She heeled over further and further, and at 21:28 she slowly capsized and went down with her flag still flying. Captain von Schönberg subsequently learned that 2 officers who had been standing on deck heard the Monmouth's officers call the men to the guns. The men were apparently engaged in stopping leaks. There was no chance of carrying out rescue work because columns of smoke were reported to be approaching from 2 directions, which could be the Good Hope and the Glasgow. Moreover, the ship's boats had been filled with water before the action and could not be launched in the heavy sea. At 21:45, the Nürnberg reported to the flagship by wireless, "Have sunk enemy cruiser," and Graf von Spee replied, "Bravo, Nürnberg."
After some hours of searching, and Nürnberg's report, von Spee knows Monmouth has sunk, but no one has actually seen Good Hope go down. So at about 22:15, von Spee decides that she had probably escaped, and he turns away north, just in case the German reports about Canopus being in the area were in fact correct.
Scharnhorst had expended 422 of her 8-inch shells, about 55% of her total available stocks, in exchange for 35 to 40 hits, a hit rate of about 8 to 10%, which is actually a pretty good achievement. In exchange, she had taken 2 6-inch hits, a dud which wound up in a storeroom, and another which blew a hole in the funnel. Gneisenau was slightly worse off. Although she had expended 244 shells and had over 2/3 of her stock left, she'd taken 4 hits, which caused some flooding and had temporarily knocked out the aft turret. Glasgow, meanwhile, was lucky. With around 600 shells fired at her, only 5 had actually landed, of which only 1 hit caused any serious issues, flooding in one compartment. However, despite the only casualties being a few scratches here and there, and some dead parrots, she'd failed to hit anything in return.
Far to the south, receiving Glasgow's radio messages, Canopus turned around and made her way back towards the Atlantic, with her increasingly insane engineer reducing her speed to a mere 9 knots. The 2 ships would join up for the transit of the Straits of Magellan and head for the Falkland Islands, with increasingly erratic signals coming from Canopus's engine room. Otranto, meanwhile, steamed out into the Pacific before likewise heading south and back into the Atlantic.
Despite being the winner, von Spee was not a happy man. He knew the forces he'd engaged were third-line units, and he was still down about half his ammunition. And now, the British would be out for revenge, making a return home, or even survival, particularly impossible. This affected him so much that when he was presented by German inhabitants of Valparaiso, he refused them, commenting that, "These will do nicely for my grave."
He was to be proved correct, for this was the first time that a British warship had been defeated at sea since the War of 1812, and the first time a squadron at sea had been lost since 1810. Upon hearing the news, Admiral Fisher was absolutely determined that this would not go unavenged, and he began organising a truly Fisher-style counterstrike. Along with Glasgow, Canopus, and the questionably useful Otranto, there were the more modern armoured cruisers HMS Carnarvon and Cornwall, with defence shortly to arrive. Also dispatched or ordered to assemble at the Falklands were the armed merchant cruiser Macedonia, the light cruiser HMS Bristol, the armoured cruiser HMS Kent, and finally the 2 battle cruisers HMS Invincible and HMS Inflexible. Canopus would be temporarily grounded to serve as a defence battery whilst Otranto was released for other service, and defence were to depart to escort a convoy once the battle cruisers arrived. But by the time von Spee rounded South America, 2 battle cruisers, 3 armoured cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and an armed merchant cruiser were waiting to greet him. But that battle is a story for another time. So that's the Battle of Coronel, done in concert with the assistance of the shipyard, and of course you may have detected there the dulcet tones of Napalm Ratter providing some of the commentary from the German perspective. Now, I'm fairly sure you probably know who Napalm Rutter is from various collaborations he's done with me before, but the shipyard is new to this, so why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself?
Hello, I am James. I am the person behind the Shipyard YouTube channel, a channel in which focuses on naval history and occasionally delves into trying to make a replica ship in a game. Aside from YouTube, I am a warfare rating in the Royal Navy, assigned to the Royal Navy flagship. In my spare time, I study naval history, naval strategy, and occasionally naval design.
So, if you're interested in naval history, Minecraft, naval history in Minecraft, or indeed you want to see guides to ships that post date 1950, as I'm famously stubborn in not doing that, then pop over to the shipyard and check it out. Link in the description below. So, with all that wrapped up, there is, of course, one final thing to do.